Director of Programs and Outreach here at the Housing Alliance. For today's webinar, we're going to be discussing eviction prevention programs that are working to keep people in their homes. I got to do a little bit of a disclaimer here. It should be in no way construed as legal advice. We know many people are either working with someone who's facing an eviction, or you yourself could be. And if you do need legal advice, of course, please contact your local legal aid agency or county bar association to find out what resources are available in your community. So now let's get to the good part. In November last year, the Housing Alliance released a report along with a series of eviction prevention resources. The report explores how eviction filings and filing rates have changed in the pre-pandemic, pandemic, and post-pandemic time periods and the communities where these changes occurred. Our goal is to provide local coalitions the data and resources needed to drive efforts to either create or expand existing eviction prevention efforts. I am excited to have three people from the Eviction Prevention Collaborative in Allegheny County here with me today. We are joined by Erin Erb with Just Mediation Pittsburgh, Abby Ray Lacombe with Rent Help Pittsburgh, and Adam Debo with Neighborhood Legal Services. So why do we need to prevent evictions? Evictions play a major role in driving people into homelessness. A recent study found that there is a significant positive association between the rate of evictions filed and the rate of sheltered homelessness. In fact, for every 1 percentage point increase in the eviction filing rate, there is an associated 0.2% increase in the following year in the rate of sheltered homelessness per 10,000 people. We also know that there is a great racial disparity within evictions. There's been, of course, much research on this as well. Some recent studies have shown, USA Today did some research that showed that if you are a Black woman in the United States, your rate of evictions surpasses that of any other demographic. And also in Pennsylvania counties, areas where there's a higher percentage of renters of color in a zip code are also experiencing higher rates of eviction filings. Black and Latino renters facing eviction were often subject to repeat filings at the same address with an average filing rate of approximately 15%. And then last but not least, we know that, once that filing happens, it really impacts accessing future housing opportunities. And landlords really don't want to rent to folks who have a record. So we also know this at the Housing Alliance because we did a large landlord survey last year where we got a pretty impressive response with 660 respondents, and nearly 80% of those for-profit landlords told us that they would not rent to someone with a record of a past eviction. And while the news on eviction filing seems rather bleak, we do want everyone to be aware that there are solutions that are working. And the following programs we are going to discuss each have three core components. Each of these components can most certainly be a standalone service and are already available in many communities. But what we are seeing is that when these services are blended together and delivered at a critical moment, we are seeing great success. And so those components are direct assistance, again, to address any rental debt, the dispute settlement component, whether it be landlord-tenant mediation or some sort of expanded access to legal representation, and resource navigation to make sure that we are quickly connecting people to resources that can really address the underlying issue that caused the housing instability in the first place. So what does success look like in these eviction prevention programs? So with pre-filing mediation, success really looks like there's no eviction filing that is happening. We see that both tenants and landlords have successfully come to an agreement and that court is avoided altogether. In uh, a program like Lawyer of the Day, what we see is that cases are withdrawn and they are settled. And, we really want to focus on these two possible outcomes because it really does show that some sort of agreement was reached, some sort of negotiation happened, and that both sides are walking away with what they need. They may not get everything that they want, but they are satisfied with the agreement that was reached and, do not want to pursue the court pathway any further. So now let's take a look at some of these promising practices at work. And that leads us to the Eviction Prevention Collaborative that is happening in Allegheny County. So again, in looking at filing rates in Allegheny County specifically, 91% of eviction filing cases involve rent in arrears. And so we do know that that is just a major contributing factor to eviction filings and to landlord-tenant disputes. But we do know that there are programs that can really make impactful changes to what's happening with eviction filings. So looking first at the landlord-tenant mediation program that's happening in Allegheny County, over 1,000 mediations happened in 2023, and almost all of those mediations ended up with the parties coming to an agreement. And, the tenants received referrals and got either, resource navigation or legal services, again, to sort of look at to make sure that these mediations are good and solid and nobody is, handing away their power or handing away their rights. Also looking at for those folks who maybe couldn't get both sides to consent to mediation, there was still that critical resource navigation to make sure people are connected to services. And we are seeing that landlords are really buying into this intervention with, over 900 referrals coming from housing authorities and, over 1,400 referrals coming from private landlords themselves. And then we want to take a look at also the Lawyer of the Day program that is happening in Allegheny County. This program began in the fall of 2023. It expanded to 4 courts within the city of Pittsburgh itself. The collaborating judges arrange their schedules to ensure landlord-tenant cases are heard on the same day. And, prior to implementation of this program, only 9% of cases were withdrawn or settled in these Lawyer of the Day courts. And now the most recent data that we looked at, we're seeing a pretty significant shift. And now it is, 46% of cases are being withdrawn and settled. And this is significantly more than what we are seeing in the other magisterial district courts in the county where this program is not available. So that is what our data and our analysis shows here at the Housing Alliance. And we looked at, filings through that are, or data from the administrative office of the Pennsylvania courts. But the really best way to hear about what's happening in these programs is to talk about the people who are, or talk to the people who are running them. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and bring it over to the panel. So I do just want to give everybody a chance to quickly introduce themselves and introduce their organization. So I would say we would go in alphabetical order, but everybody has an A name. But we'll start with Aaron.
I get a lot of pocket dials, so I get that first in the alphabet thing a lot. Good to be with y'all today. My name's Aaron Erb. I'm the executive director at Just Mediation Pittsburgh. So we're the folks that organize the mediations between landlords and tenants and work with both of these organizations to do so.
Great. Abby Ray?
Aaron and Adam, it's never occurred to me that we all share that trauma of the A name. Like, oh, hey, and it's like the inside of somebody's pocket. Like, oh, okay. My name's Abby Ray Lacombe. I'm the executive director of Rent Help Pittsburgh. We started in 2020 to assist families in accessing COVID rental relief. And then through collaboration with the Create Lab at Carnegie Mellon University, started doing outreach to households in Allegheny County with eviction filings against them to ensure that they were aware of the CDC moratorium. And from that outreach, we really have built a niche of providing resource navigation assistance to families experiencing eviction, experiencing orders for possession, or at risk of it in terms of mediation.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Adam Debo. I manage the housing department at Neighborhood Legal Services. We are the legal aid firm, which covers Allegheny, Beaver, Butler, and Lawrence counties. We provide the legal assistance, the legal advice prior to mediations, and we provide one part of the legal assistance, giving attorneys to the Lawyer of the Day program to 2 courts in the city of Pittsburgh.
Great. So often eviction is thought of as a zero-sum game, right? With clear winners and losers, but that there are only these 2 outcomes. But in looking at the impact of your program, we see that you're helping landlords and tenants come to an agreement. And I'm just curious what you all think makes your program such a success.
I can go first here. Yeah. Well, just one of the things that I think about right away is the shifts that I've experienced. So I think on the mediation side of things, it feels kind of obvious perhaps how mediation is a more collaborative environment and how that helps both parties then come to agreements that can benefit them more. And so we will definitely speak to that a lot, but I just actually want to shout out Lawyer of the Day first, as the person of the 3 of us on this call who does not administer that program. I came into this work in 2020 with Just Mediation Pittsburgh with a very clear sense of attorneys in the legal aid space for tenants being like so gung-ho in that space that you could like lose the forest for the trees, like win the individual argument, perhaps lose what's good for the parties themselves. And again, mediation's good in that space, but I just want to like shout out the work that Adam and his team have done to actually present a place for very much advocating for the tenant. No apologies about that, no mistakes there, anything, but in a way that is asking like, what is going to help make this situation work well? And the Lawyer of the Day program has just been an excellent place in the court system for that to occur. So even as mediation is like a first place to turn, perhaps when we think about collaboration, what the stories that I hear in this close collaboration are that Lawyer of the Day is a place where attorneys like going to those courts, enjoy having these teams there because they're places where solutions are found, even after somebody has made the choice to file, which is a choice that they could avoid if they went to mediation instead.
I think it's interesting between the 2 programs. And in the one room in mediation, Aaron and I have to work with our landlord partners a lot to ensure that they understand that the resource navigator is indeed a tenant's advocate. And in that space, the resource navigator has a prolonged relationship frequently with the landlord because we work with them time and time and time again. And every now and then we'll have a tenant who does not feel as comfortable sharing their story or sharing their concerns. In the Lawyer of the Day space, the resource navigators, again, have these prolonged ongoing relationships, but very often we actually get to be the ally to the landlord in the room because the tenants are represented by attorneys who are actually going to be doing all of the advocating inside of that space. So one of the things that I think has led to these very positive outcomes is that we are recognizing the importance of a resource navigator as a tenant advocate, as well as a translator to a landlord of the benefits that they get by working with us, and meld those two together to ensure that households are accessing the assistance that they need to stay in their homes, and landlords are actually getting the arrears that they need covered.
I'll pick it up off the, covering the arrears is foundational, right? Like the work that Rent Help Pittsburgh is doing is foundational to getting everybody back on track after the pandemic, after the filing rates started to get back to normal and hopefully don't go above pre-pandemic rates at this point. But rental assistance has been foundational. But I think even with rental assistance, one of the things that Aaron was talking about was by the time you've made it to court, the communication between landlord and tenant has really deteriorated to a degree where it's gotten to the point where you have to go to court. But where you've gone to court. And I think Aaron is right that a lot of the attorneys who were going to court prior to us starting this program were, a lot of times winning the case and is helpful for your tenant, and that's their best interest. But there's a lot of times where reaching a peaceable solution and getting the arrears paid and getting that communication back on the mend between landlord and tenant is going to put them in a more stable place to maintain their housing moving forward. So you're looking at not just winning a battle or winning the particular case at hand, but looking at it, and I hate this word, but I say it all the time, more holistically, and trying to figure out how to resolve like the underlying issues and to make sure that like, oh, if there's an issue next time, instead of going to court, maybe landlord will call tenant, or maybe they'll mediate, or maybe, we'll find another resolution outside of going to court here. And I think that's been kind of bridging that communication gap has been a very large part of the success of the program as well.
Excellent, excellent. So for my next question, I just want to focus in a little bit on the landlord-tenant mediation program and just what does that process look like from beginning to end?
I'm sorry, I was getting distracted by the chat in the side, which I'd love to address at some point and get to that, Gail. Can you frame that again for me?
What does a typical landlord-tenant mediation process look like beginning to end?
Yeah, thank you. Right now, we are only doing landlord-tenant mediations from Just Mediation Pittsburgh at the pre-filing level. So before a landlord has decided to file against their tenant, we are doing mediations between landlords and tenants. And so either landlord or tenant, or even a third party like social service provider or something that's most likely working with a tenant, can reach out to JMP to request mediation. JMP's team talks with the person who's requested the mediation, make sure they understand that they've requested, in fact, to talk with the other party, because that's just culturally something that we're not as comfortable with, is actually like directly confronting something that has been going wrong and thinking about what can I do, what can you do to help resolve this issue. And once that person who's requested mediation has agreed to it fully, we then contact the other party. So if the landlord requested this, which they often do because we built some partnerships with them, we'll reach out to their tenant. But similarly, if a tenant has requested this, we'll reach out to their landlord and see if they're willing to mediate with us, which means explaining to them that this is a place where you have free access to a third party, the mediator, who can help each person listen to each other and also be really clear about what they need so that they're fully addressing the range of issues that might be on the table. A tenant might be coming to mediation because there's been a habitability issue that they really need addressed to be able to live in a safe and habitable place. A landlord might be coming to mediation because rent was behind by a month or two and they need that addressed. Neither of those issues needs to take priority over the other. The mediation's there for all issues to be addressed by the parties as much as they are willing to address them. So it's a very much like a voluntary but motivated space to come to mutually satisfying agreements, essentially, right? Before you have to spend money to go to court, before you have to go through the stress of working in that system. What can we do here? And the process involves working very closely with Rent Help and NLS. So once parties have decided to mediate, my staff reaches out to Rent Help, who has mediation resource navigators who are there to advocate for the tenant and navigate various resources, but especially rental assistance resources to help grease the wheels for a mediation agreement. You can say what you want to do. Here are some resources that will help you do what you said you want to do to be made whole. And similarly, at that time, we're reaching out to neighborhood legal services if a tenant has requested legal advice prior to a mediation. And in fact, we have an opt-out system for that legal advice for public housing recipients, so that folks who are receiving any kind of a subsidy know that they have legal advice available to them prior to their mediation, because we know that informed tenants lead to more sustainable agreements, which is good for the tenants, of course, and very good for a landlord too. You're working with a more educated party who knows what's possible for them. So once those resources have been explored, and there's a lot more detail that y'all could speak to as well there, we then have the mediation. Our community mediators, who we've trained in 40 hours to mediate these services, so they're experts in what they do, mediate these disputes over Zoom, which has made things more accessible than an in-person mediation might, where you have to take 2 buses and walk a mile to be able to get to where you'd be going. And once parties have had their mediation, and whether they reached an agreement or not, they'll receive kind of a follow-up from what happened there. And if they reached an agreement, which they do 98% of the time in our program, they get a copy of their agreement, and it's an addendum to their lease that says, this is what we've agreed to on top of what the provisions of our lease already say we have agreed to and committed to do together. And then there's usually work for rent help to do from there, and sometimes some NLS, and maybe I'll turn it over to y'all to explain that.
You're muted.
I thought so. Yeah, so as Aaron said, prior to the mediation, we start reaching out to tenants about a week before their mediation. And if it's a new landlord, we will also reach out to the landlord. With the tenants, what we're really discussing is what led to our current situation and what do you think that you need to resolve it. Almost always it includes rental assistance, but many other times it is that they need a new job or they want a new career path. They recently had a child, they need access to child care. They started a new job, they were just behind due to income, but now they really want to understand how they can make their dollars stretch as effectively as possible. And we are going to work with them to identify other service providers in Allegheny County to help remedy those longer term needs. Once the mediation is complete and we have the agreement in hand, then we can work with them on the rental assistance component. We will have already done the assessment based on previous usage, access to different rental assistances. In Allegheny County, we, at the beginning of 2023, made the decision to combine all of our rental assistance programs into one umbrella through DHS and then administered through Action Housing. And then Action Housing subcontracts a handful of service providers, rent help included, to work with people on their rental assistance applications. So we'll work with both the tenant and the landlord to get the application completed, and we see the application all the way to the point of payment. So we're also the point of contact if there's any sort of issue with an ACH not making it to the bank account, but also if a landlord files after the mediation has been completed, we are typically still in touch with that tenant. And so we will then be referring back to neighborhood legal services for an eviction filing.
I was just going to touch a little bit on our role, but mostly how it facilitates the rental assistance and the folks coming to terms on a mediation. So we talk to people beforehand, and sometimes our advice is, like Aaron said, just making sure that tenants are well informed. Our kind of philosophy is nobody ever made a worse decision by being more well informed. So folks aren't mediating with a misunderstanding of what their rights are, or they're not mediating with a kind of thought in their mind that isn't true. Maybe they think that they have a better case or a better claim than they actually do. And sometimes our best advice is, you're mistaken about what's going on. It's really in your best interest to reach a conclusion here. And sometimes telling tenants that their landlord is in fact correct is not what they want to hear, but we are welcome to be the bearers of that news. But then again, once there is a mediation reached, we can review mediation agreements as well. We do that often. And as Aaron said, they are lease addendums. So that's really helpful for enforcement and things like that. But really there is legal advice, but it's also an educational role to make sure that folks go in and go into mediation with the most knowledge about their landlord-tenant relationship, and then feel comfortable signing their agreement with a review as well.
Great, thank
Did
you.
you, Gail, in that question, want us to go through sort of the timeline of lawyer of the day as well?
That was going to be my next question.
Oh, okay, good.
Yes, now that we've talked about landlord-tenant mediation, what does a typical day for lawyer of the day look like? Or what does the sort of typical experience for a tenant look like?
So lawyer of the day will start at rent help. Actually, it will start with a landlord going to the Magisterial District Court to file. We have 46 courts in Allegheny County, and Rent Help does actually do outreach to tenants at all 46 courts. Though the Lawyer of the Day program is in 4 courts inside of the city of Pittsburgh. And we've been there since October of 2022. So it's going well. The point that the eviction is filed, Rent Help has a docket scraping system that essentially pulls the dockets as they are processed into the UJS portal into a database that allows us to see all new filings sorted by judge. From that, in collaboration with Allegheny County Department of Human Services, we start doing outreach to all of the families with an eviction filing against them. Our first round of outreach is text. We actually have had really good success with text. In an average sense, we probably have close to a 55% good numbers rate, which is terrific. It's terrific. So thank you, DHS. After texting, we begin calling. We have access to previous rental assistance applications and so on. So we also will email any email addresses that they provided for previous applications. The timeline for the outreach is really tight. From when an eviction is filed to when we're going to be in court is around 7 to 10 days. So we are hitting the outreach as hard as possible so that we can make the referral to neighborhood or the other legal partner, Ebony Law, in advance of the hearing, so that when the attorneys go in, they are prepared to represent at that time. For all those that we are not able to connect with in advance, we have resource navigators in the courts who essentially are receiving folks in order to do real-time registrations and then refer them in person to the attorney that is also present. And then throughout our relationship with them, as referenced many times, we're working with them on rental assistance, utility assistance, what brought you here and what is it going to take to prevent you from getting here again.
Yeah, so like Abby Ray said, the ideal situation is that the text outreach is done. That's a crucial role in making sure that we're casting as wide of a net as possible for the courts that we're in, and getting as many folks to the legal providers prior to their court date, because that makes life better for everybody, for resource navigators, for the attorneys, for the tenant and the landlord, right? Fingers crossed you can get to court and something is nearly resolved by the time that you get there. So we reach out to those clients that were referred prior to the court date. We figure out the best resolution for them. Sometimes that's a straight up legal defense that they have. But most of the time, it's a combination of a little bit of that and rental assistance as well. Sometimes it's just straight up rental assistance. So again, we give them that information, we give them that advice, and then we are stationed there in the courts on the days that there are the landlord-tenant hearings. We met with the 4 judges for the courtrooms that we are in, talk to them about how they are scheduling their hearings, making sure that they're having their landlord-tenant hearings on a day where we will have the legal aid staff there, in addition to the resource navigation staff. And we talk to our clients as they come in. And like Abby Ray said, for the folks that we weren't able to get in contact with prior to the court date, they are given an intake for rental assistance right then and there, referred to a legal partner right then and there. And the judges understand, after working with our program for, probably over a year and a half at this point, just about a year and a half at this point, that we're going to connect them to all the resources possible. They'll usually grant continuances, and then we have our hearings for cases that have to have hearings. Maybe rental assistance is dispersed, and we get some outcomes at that point. But realistically, if the process goes as smoothly as possible, we are ready to, we have our solution to the case prior to the court date, and we are just at that point taking the steps to get that solution into practice, right? Whether that be we get a 2-week continuance for the rental assistance application to get processed, or we get a recertification done, or whatever it might be, the solution is already on the table by the time we get to court for the first time, for those folks that are early and active and responsive to those text messages. I'm not sure if you want us to discuss outcomes at this point, or if that was going to be another question, or if there's any follow-up questions about that.
I think it's a nice natural segue if you want to get into some of the outcomes that you've been able to achieve. I mean, we showed some of the outcomes, right? This, dramatic increase in cases withdrawn and settled, but are there other outcomes that, of course, is not reflected in the court data that you would like to share?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing that I'll just preface it with this, because the unfortunate part is our no-show rates for cases have gone way, way, way down with this affirmative outreach done by Rental Pittsburgh. But unfortunately, there still needs to be a lot of, I think, education around how landlord-tenant eviction proceedings work. And some folks get very scared when they get a notice to quit, things like that. So we do still see a few no-shows, which is unfortunate. We're trying to minimize those. But for folks that are either responding to text messages or showing up in court, right? You've filtered into the program in some way, shape, or form. We categorize our positive outcomes a little bit differently. You've done settlements and withdrawals, which I think is kind of what generally folks would consider positive outcomes for both landlord and tenant, right? The landlord has chosen to withdraw the case under their own volition. That's an affirmative action taken by the landlord to withdraw the case. Or a settlement, right? They've come to court, they've said, we've been paid up, we've reached a resolution, this case can be marked as settled. And I think judges see them that way as well. But things that we also capture as positive outcomes are dismissals. And these happen for a few reasons. Sometimes judges just see these dismissals as being equivalent to withdrawals or settlements. And this is basically just judges defining these things different ways. So we've seen our rates of dismissals go way up as well. And then judgments for the tenant as well. We see these as positive outcomes because if there is a case where there has to be a strict legal defense raised, we will make that and potentially win that case. Or sometimes we actually have landlord no-shows, right? The landlord got paid. They didn't show up to court because they got their money. And sometimes we see those as dismissals and or for judgments for defendants as well. So, when you're taking into account the withdrawals and the settlements, you had an increase of nearly 40%. That's true with those statistics. When we're capturing our positive outcomes, as we call them, we're looking at somewhere in the high 60s, right? So we're looking at an aggregate of nearly a 60% increase in those positive outcome rates that we see. And the thing that this doesn't take into account as well is obviously it's everyone's goal to prevent a judgment against a tenant for many reasons, right? The tenant doesn't want to have a judgment looming over their head. And even if there is a judgment, the landlord has to go through additional steps to actually try to collect on that, which is a pain. So our positive outcomes, and this one can't really be captured by the magisterial district court dockets, would be cases where there is a judgment that is later satisfied by rental assistance as well. And when we take those into account, we're looking at somewhere in the 70s. So for our 4 particular courts that we're in, we were looking at, I think the stat that you had pre-pandemic was about 8% of the withdrawals or settlements. And if you're incorporating all of what we consider as a positive outcome, right, we're looking at somewhere in the mid 70s for our positive outcomes. And that's, again, good for everybody. Landlords are getting paid. These relationships between landlord and tenant are being repaired. And every judge that we've talked to is extremely happy, right? It's far better to have multiple individuals in the courtroom who are working towards a single unified solution, as opposed to 2 people in the courtroom who don't even want to talk to each other. So the judge's feedback on that front has been great as well. But again, I mean, I can toss it over to Abby Ray and or Aaron, right? It's a huge foundational part of it is rental assistance as well, and that's truly what keeps a large part of this program afloat. Is landlords are being made whole as well.
I think maybe outcomes that I would highlight from the mediation program are, again, one that our settlement rate is a really important one, and it's a nice flashy number of 98% of people who have agreed to mediate together do in fact then reach an agreement once they're in their mediation together. That is not a number that we were ever shooting for because it felt really unrealistic. Like Adam said, rental assistance and then bringing in resource navigation to help parties actually find like tangible ways to make agreement and sustain agreement together has been huge. Legal aid for tenants to be able to come in more educated, I think, has also played a role in that number being so high. And I've been saying it now for like 3 years, and it hasn't happened yet, but it has to happen, that number will go down, right? Especially as rental assistance luxuries of the COVID and somewhat post-COVID world have dwindled and are now reaching a huge inflection point. We know that rental assistance will look different than it has for these last few years. We don't know how exactly, but I would assume less to a degree, and we're fighting hard to make sure that in Allegheny County, there's a really robust rental assistance landscape, so that not so that people come back to the trough forever, of course, but so that when they are showing the initiative like they are in these 2 programs, and maybe especially in mediation, to try and address issues before they have to go the nuclear route of filing and perhaps going to court and then perhaps actually getting an order for possession, that they're trying to work things out. And if you're trying to work things out, are there ways that our city and county can support those parties to stabilize housing? So 98% agreement rates have been incredible. I would expect those to drop. They haven't for years. So I've kept on being wrong as I try to set expectations in a more reasonable place. But another thing that I want to highlight, as far as an outcome in some ways, is who's actually mediating these cases. So again, JMP has trained community members to be the mediators. We're a community mediation center. So we are not trying to only have a really professionalized group of folks mediating these cases. Otherwise we would have hired, like 3 staff and they would mediate all the time. What we do instead is have community mediators mediate these cases after they've been really well trained. And that we pay them a stipend to do that. And that has allowed us to have a mediator pool that better reflects the parties that are in mediation. So we have folks who have been landlords or are landlords who are mediating. We have folks who have experienced eviction and been evicted either in childhood or adulthood who are now mediating. We have folks who have worked in the housing space more broadly to help support folks, especially tenants who have been at risk of losing their homes. And we also have a much more diverse pool of mediators economically and racially than we might have otherwise if this was a professionalized or if this was a voluntary mediation pool. So about 50% of our mediators are people of color, which is above the rates of white and non-white populations in Pittsburgh, but a little more in line with the people who are being threatened with eviction, which we know are historically, like Gail said, people of color, women-led households, and of course, low-income households as well. So that's not necessarily an outcome, but it's something that I always want to highlight because the program can take many shapes and different places will set up different programs. We wanted when for as long as we had the luxury to, while we were paying mediators as community mediators, to be able to make sure that that meant that we were recruiting a really like rich and diverse range of who our community actually is.
Great, great. So I think my last question to all of you before we open it up to some questions from the audience is, what are the key steps that are people that are looking to replicate your program should be aware of? I don't know if we want to break it up by the landlord-tenant mediation program versus lawyer of the day, because they are two separate programs.
I would put forth, firstly, don't try to do it alone. This, what we have had, the most important ingredient to our success up to this point has been that this is a deeply collaborative and far-ranging vision of eviction prevention. If Rent Help had shown up on the scene and was like, we're going to build this thing. And when we did, we didn't have close ties with JMP and we didn't have close ties with NLS. We were all sort of operating in our own sectors, and realizing the need for the overlap and the ways that our different focuses supported the overall vision of the individual programs, but also the eviction prevention goal as a whole, was huge in enabling us to garner much broader support from the city, from the county, and from so many of our peer organizations, that none of us were showing up at the table one at a time and saying, my organization's going to do this thing. We always show up together and say, our organizations have been building this together, and here's our success so far.
Yeah, I think just to go off of that a little bit, this idea wasn't just, I mean, we didn't pull it out of thin air, right? This is based upon kind of an amalgamation of a lot of other programs that weren't just mediation and weren't just rental assistance and weren't just lawyer of the day and or a kind of precursor to right to counsel or whatever it might be. It was looking at other cities that have general eviction diversion programs, looking at the resources that we have in the city and in Allegheny County and understanding how we can best utilize those resources. Obviously, we looked at folks in Philadelphia a lot, but we really started meeting as this collaborative during COVID, and came out of it in late 2020 with this concrete program that we had that hopefully folks don't even have to get to lawyer of the day because cases are getting mediated. But if they do, we are, we're in these courts, you're getting access to rental assistance, you're getting access to legal aid. So it was a lot of planning, a lot of prep, a lot of legwork. And that goes into, making sure that our organizations are working together as seamlessly as possible, making sure that landlords understand what it is. Because some landlords are like, I got to show up to a court where there's going to be a lawyer arguing against me every day. Like, don't want that. But that's not, we're here to find a resolution as well. And making sure that the judges know what's going on, right? You're disrupting the way that a court has worked for the last however many years. And some of the judges we already had good relationships with. Some of the judges were new and were welcoming to these ideas. They've all been welcoming, but you have to look at them and say, we're going to be posted up in your courtroom every week until we can't any longer. And it's going to fundamentally change the way that you handle landlord-tenant cases. So there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be laid before you just do this. But as long as you have your resources and you utilize the help of other folks that have programs like this, then it's definitely doable. The blueprints are out there.
Even down to scheduling, I was just thinking, all of the courts that we are in, and this is true for basically all the courts in Allegheny County, tend to do some eviction hearings each day. And for this to succeed, we needed the courts that we were in to select a day, and we needed it to be a different day than the other courts so that we could man each court correctly. And that took us a few months of working with the judges to make sure, because, you know, at first they were resistant, and I've always done it this way. And then, why weren't you there? This tenant like really needed your guys's program. And we're like, and this is exactly why we need you to choose a day. We have Tuesdays available.
On the mediation side of things, just to add to what Adam and Abby Ray have said, with collaboration is going to address some of Anna's question in the chat too. For mediation, we were introducing a familiar word, a familiar tool, but a new place to be doing that and using that tool, to have mediation in a landlord-tenant space instead of court, where people like know the formula. In Allegheny County, that formula was 86% of the time a landlord's going to win in their filing. And so with mediation, we knew from talking with partners over in Philadelphia who have a great eviction diversion program that most of you probably know about. We knew that in a voluntary mediation process prior to the pandemic, they had, you know, gotten, I think, a couple hundred requests from tenants to do mediation with their landlord, and they had only had a few landlords accept that invitation. So we knew we had to reach out to landlords as we were developing this program to say, here's what this tool is, here's how it can benefit you, so that they knew this is something that's actually worth their investment of time, and it's worth saving their money for, essentially. Amazingly difficult to break that habit of paying money to go to court, to lose money by not getting rental assistance, rental arrears paid if you evict a tenant in court. You think it's dollars and cents, but the free market is not working in that way. It is easier sometimes for landlords to go to court and lose money to get what they want, which is the tenant gone. And so we had to do a lot of persuasion to say, to explore, like, do you want that? Is that the actual solution here, or is that the tried and true method that is costly and a time suck and actually not good for your business, and not good, of course, for whatever relationship you might have with your tenant? So a lot of landlord outreach with the housing authorities. We did a lot of work with them, and they were receptive over time to this. And so they've become incredible referral partners for mediation, where we have tried to work with them to say, okay, if you're bought into mediation, let's make the referral process easier for you. And so we've worked with them to do that, so that it's less burdensome for them on the front end of things. And similarly, they've worked with us to be able to think about and then adapt to, okay, if we're saying we want to work with tenants to keep them here, but also to right the wrongs and not just have some kind of a blanket forgiveness here, what might that require of us? How might we need to extend our repayment plan policy so that people can feasibly pay back what is owed if rental assistance is not available and they're on a fixed income? They've been really responsive to that. And so I really recommend, if you're looking to start up any of these programs, to think about reaching out to the partners and the stakeholders who you might not have thought would initially be receptive to this, because there's a case to be made.
And I appreciate you mentioning that, Aaron, because Anna Smith asked in the chat. I will say at this stage, our two largest housing authorities are also two of our biggest fans. It took many years to get reality to look this way. It started first with, I think, a lot more collaboration between NLS and CJP and RHP on who we were seeing evicted, and being able to hold the housing authorities to account to their own mission statement, to what they proclaim to be doing, and really publicly saying, like, if you're going to be doing this while you're saying this, why aren't you going to mediation where we can help you? But it was years of building these relationships to get them as successful and cooperative as they are.
And on that again, briefly as well, I mean, I think just by numbers, the housing authorities have to be some of the biggest evictors in really any community. So those are the folks that we have seen in courts. We see the same property managers. We've seen their attorneys in courts many, many times before we started this program. And I think that's one of the reasons you develop those relationships, and you can say, well, we have a better way to do this now, right? We have a way where you can expend less resources going downtown to the court of common pleas, going to arbitration, going to trial. You can expend less resources in evicting somebody if you work with us on this program. And at some point, it comes down to sometimes, like what Aaron said, the dollars and cents, right? It is good for everyone's bottom line if rental assistance is paid and folks become whole, right? Tenants keep a roof over their head, landlords get paid rental arrears. But if the case also has to go on to litigation, or that's the path that it might be headed, working out some sort of other resolution at the magistrate level, when you can have attorneys talking to each other, or you can have somebody there trying to bridge that communication gap, like I talked about, saves the housing authorities sending two property managers off their site to arbitration, sending an attorney to arbitration, sending those same folks back to trial, having them on motion hearings. It saves a lot of hours and kind of time where folks are away from doing what their other jobs are, right? Managing the properties and things like that. And just kind of sitting down and explaining those things to them, I think, was also extremely helpful.
Great, thank you. So I think we have time for probably one more question. And that question looks at, what if you guys are looking at data on positive outcomes for the court themselves and convincing them to collaborate with programs such as yours?
Iberia, if you want to start, or I can kind of just.
Belinda, I'm not sure that we have much data in terms of how this saves the court's money. I think what it does more so, like what our judges have reported, is it allows them to do their job more easily and with the intent that they pursued their job in. Like, they actually do get to work with the parties in front of them from far less of a he said, she said, and far more of a well-informed understanding. And I think for the judges that we work with and the many judges that wish we were there, it is that leveling that is the great appeal.
100%. I'll reflect back to what Aaron was saying about neighborhood doing some pre-mediation advice. The thing I did right before this webinar was speak to a client who has a mediation coming up. And she kept the best records of any client that I've maybe ever talked to in my entire life. She had rental receipts from 2019, and I went through every single one of them. And I was thinking to myself the entire time, this is incredible. I wish every one of my clients was as prepared as this. My life would be so much easier. My job would be so much easier. And that's what the judges are getting, right? Like, when you come into court and you've already talked to Rent Help Pittsburgh and your rental assistance application is already underway, and you've already talked to Neighborhood Legal Services or our partner Ebony, and they already understand where your legal grounds are at, and you already have a solution on the table, by the time you get to court, the judge just says, what's going on? And instead of having two parties who don't want to talk to each other give two versions of the same story, maybe they're bickering, it's a he said, she said, like Abby Ray was talking about. Instead, there's a resource navigator who says, yep, we have this document and this document, the application is on this step. And there's the attorney saying, this is what's happening, this is the legal defense, and we need to do X, Y, and Z to put the tenant in a better position so that this doesn't happen again. So instead of having to draw out the facts and draw out the testimony and put in serious groundwork to just understand what's going on, that's just presented to the judge off the top as soon as the hearing starts on most occasions. So I don't know if that data is, it's not quantifiable, right? But we have meetings with the judges regularly, and they love the program for that reason. And also, I mean, no judge wants to go to their job and be the person that has to evict everybody that comes in front of them. And they also don't want to go to their job and have to look at every landlord and say, sorry, you're not getting paid. And with our program, they don't have to do either of those things.
Belinda did have another question, a little bit more about like details. And just to like scan through those real quick, Belinda, like wanting a program, beginning conversation. So I think we've given you some beginning conversation points. We don't have technology requirements for the courts. Rent Help had invested in tablets for our team and so that they could register in real time, and they don't use those. We've really found that paper registration and then going back to the office and entering has worked out best. At present, we do have program requirements that are based on our funder. Our funding is the City of Pittsburgh's Housing Opportunity Fund. So it is local taxes, and that is pretty much our exclusive funder for Lawyer of the Day. And that has a 50% AMI and requires that they are in the city of Pittsburgh, which is a little difficult because one of the courts that we're in is on the border. So that part can be a little bit tricky. But we're lucky that NLS is a partner in that court because we are able to refer to neighborhood using different funding sources to cover those folks. And cost to administer the program, not sure off the top of our heads, even though we make budgets, it feels like every 2 or 3 months. And so you'd think it would be there, but I apologize.
No worries, we can include some of that information and follow up. But I do think that kind of maybe gives a nice segue to how we want to round out today's conversation. You know, these programs are so powerful, they're so impactful. And as Erin mentioned earlier, the resources that really seeded these programs came through the pandemic, and they're starting to go away. And so we really want to see a permanent state investment in eviction prevention programming that we know is critical to preventing homelessness. And so the Housing Alliance is in fact working on this issue. And we do have a sign-on for support for a permanent state investment in eviction prevention programs and programs that do have these 3 core components that are working together. That is, you know, the direct assistance, the dispute settlement component, whether it be lawyer of the day or landlord-tenant mediation, as well as the resource navigation. So we do hope that you will sign on to that letter. Jen, can we put that in the chat? If
course.
not, Jen is going to put it up in the chat. We are also going to send it out with the follow-up materials. We have links on our website. Of course, if you aren't already signed up for our newsletter because you signed up for this webinar, you should be getting it. So we are most certainly going to be keeping people apprised as we work on this very, very important resource to support these great programs. Also, if you are starting these programs and are looking to get connected to other folks who are doing this work, please feel free to reach out to me. I am happy to facilitate any connections and peer learning that I can and that the Housing Alliance can. So with that, I want to say thank you to our amazing panel for giving us a little bit of their time and expertise today, and to thank all of you for joining us. And we will see you next time.
Thank you all so much. Like Gail said, we will send out the recording and all the materials afterwards. And remember, today is the last day to register for our Rural Housing Summit and our Land Bank Summit. Take care, everyone. Have a good day.